Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Planetarium show. My name is Jessica. I'm the director of the Planetarium, and with me tonight are two of our students who I will let say hi and introduce themselves, and we will start with Eli.
Hi, I'm Eli. I'm a physics and astronomy student at UMD.
Hi, I'm Braden. I'm a music education major here at UMD.
All right, so tonight we have a very fun show for you. As we know, it is the holiday season, and you may be looking at getting a telescope for yourself or someone interested in astronomy. That's the word I was looking for. So what our goal is tonight with the show is to give you some background knowledge about kind of what the different parts of the telescope are, what these different words are that you might hear associated with telescopes, and then give you some recommendations for some good beginner telescopes, and even kind of next stages beyond as well. And then at the end, a little bit of just kind of what you can expect from using your telescope for the first time. All right, so as we jump into this, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments. Eli is going to be keeping an eye on that for me and will let me know as questions come up. We'll also have time at the end for questions as well. And with that...
Oh, we actually just got our first question.
Awesome.
How do you know which way to put the different lenses in a telescope?
Are you talking about building a telescope?
I think probably more talking about eyepieces.
But those usually have a very obvious direction.
I'm gonna put words in the commenter's mouth. Like, what situation is it best to use what lenses or what eyepieces?
Okay, so we will touch on that a little bit. And if you would like to, if we are misinterpreting your question or you have more information, feel free to add that in to the comments, and I will.
Yes, the
eyepieces. Okay, cool. I will definitely talk about different eyepieces a little bit later, so we will get to that. All right, so beginner's guide to telescopes. Let's start off with the different types of telescopes. So there are 2 to 3, you typically say 2 main types, but I'm going to show you 3 different types of telescopes today. And they can be described based off of what is doing the collecting and magnifying of the light. So the very first type of telescope we're going to talk about is the refracting telescope, or a refractor. This is actually the very first type of telescope that was ever made. It was created in 1608 by a lens maker named Hans Lippershey, not Galileo. That is a very common misconception. Galileo did not invent the telescope. And so what this type of telescope does is it has a lens at the front of the telescope tube that collects the light and focuses it down the telescope tube to the back, where you then have a second lens, which is your eyepiece, which then takes that light and projects it onto your eye so that you can see an image. So refracting telescopes, they have a lens at the front, and they generally have a long telescope tube. Now, there are a lot of issues with refracting telescopes, the biggest of which is something called chromatic aberration. I know it's a fancy word, but what it basically means is when light of different colors passes through that glass lens of the telescope, the lens actually bends the different colors by different amounts. And so your blue light is not going to focus at the same point as your green light, which is not going to focus at the same point as your red light. And so you end up with something like this here on the right. You end up with a kind of rainbow spread of whatever object you're looking at. You don't see all of the colors nicely together. They're kind of spread out. And this is just, it's what lenses do. It is a natural fact of what lenses are, it's how they interact with light, so it's a natural byproduct of that. There are ways to correct this. Oops, went too far. There are ways to correct this, and that's by building more complicated lenses of slightly different types of glass and slightly different shapes. But of course, the more complicated the lens becomes, the more expensive it's going to be. So to get a refracting telescope that does not have chromatic aberration, or I can't say does it because it's always going to have a little bit, but minimizes that as much as possible, you're looking at a very expensive telescope to pay for that very complicated lens to minimize that effect. So that leads us to our next type of telescope, which is the reflecting telescope, or the reflector. This was actually invented about 60 years later in 1668 by Isaac Newton. And instead of having a lens at the front of the telescope, it actually has a mirror that sits at the back of the telescope. And so the light comes down through the telescope tube, bounces off of the curved mirror, which focuses the light back up the tube where there's a secondary mirror to bounce the light out to your eyepiece, which then projects the image onto your, I was about to say screen, onto your eye. So that's the big difference, right? I'm messing up with my words. I'm sorry, guys. The refractor has the lens at the front. The reflector has a mirror at the back. And the good thing about a mirror is you don't have that chromatic aberration. All colors of light bounce off of a mirror in exactly the same way. And so you're able to have a good telescope image without having that kind of rainbow effect that lenses give you. Now, that doesn't mean that reflectors are not without their own problems. Depending on what shape the mirror is, you can sometimes get what we call coma, which is just when you see kind of like a star that's on the edge of the field you're looking at through your telescope, it might become distorted. But that's usually not a problem for people because whatever you're looking at is going to be smack in the center of your field of view. And you don't have this coma effect in the center of your field of view. So having some distortion around the edge is really not that big of a deal because you're usually not concerned about the very edge. You want what you're looking at to be front and center. All right, so that brings us to the third type, which is really just a mix of the two. So this is a compound or catadioptric. Basically, it has both a mirror and a lens. You have a mirror at the back, and then a lens at the front. And the idea is these two are made to kind of work together to minimize the errors that they both have. So this lens helps to correct the problem at the edge of the mirror, and the mirror helps to correct the chromatic aberration of the lens. So it's kind of the best of both worlds working together. But of course, since you have both a mirror and a lens, these types of telescopes tend to be a bit pricier than just a reflecting telescope because you're paying for that lens as well. And I forgot to mention, reflecting telescopes in general tend to be a bit cheaper because it's a lot easier to make mirrors than it is to make nice, clear, not air, wow, I'm completely liking words tonight. Defect-free lenses. So it's cheaper to make mirrors than lenses for the most part, or at least good mirrors and lenses. So this is our compound catadioptric. So those are our three main telescope types, right? Refracting uses a lens, reflecting uses a mirror, and compound or catadioptric uses both. So that's the first kind of decision and thing you're going to see when looking for telescopes, is having to decide what type of telescope do you want. And for the most part, for beginners, we would recommend a reflecting telescope because you don't have the error of the lens or the chromatic aberration of the lens. They are generally a bit cheaper to make, and they're a bit sturdier as well and tend to survive bumps and bruises, we'll say, a little bit better because that mirror is tucked down in the telescope tube instead of being right out front. All right, but then the next decision that you're going to have to make is what type of telescope mount do you want? And this is what the telescope itself actually sits on. And there are two main types. The one we're showing you here is an Altitude-Azimuth mount, or an Alt-Az mount. And the general idea is this mount moves your telescope side to side and up and down. It's a very intuitive way of moving your telescope and is usually the best option for beginners because it is a very intuitive, just side to side, up to down. Very easy to move, very easy to understand what you need to do to move the telescope from one position to the next. Now, the other type of telescope mount that you may see is an equatorial mount. And this will either be labeled as Equatorial or it may just have EQ in the telescope name. This type of mount is meant to be aligned with the North Star, and it moves in kind of arcs and circles. And so the idea is for an experienced telescope user, this actually tends to be an easier way to move and track a telescope because it mimics the natural motion of the stars and night sky objects as they rotate around the North Star and rotate around the sky. But for beginners, it is very unintuitive and it has a steep learning curve to set up because you have to make sure that you are perfectly aligned with the North Star in order to get the benefits of an equatorial mount. So I would recommend staying away from this type of mount to begin with and getting an Alt-Az mount because they're very easy to set up and very intuitive to use. Now, with that said, something you'll also notice is there are some telescope mounts that are computerized or are labeled as go-to telescopes. The idea with this is computerized telescopes have a little computer in it that has a catalog of night sky objects. And that catalog can tell you where to point the telescope to see whatever object you want to look at. Now, I've recently learned that there are actually two different types of computerized telescopes you can get. The one that I'm most familiar with, and if you know of computerized telescopes, what you're probably familiar with, is the type that has a motorized mount, that actually has a motor to move the telescope to where you want it to go. So I could say, point at Jupiter, and the telescope would move itself to point at Jupiter. But there are computerized telescopes that are what we call push-to, where the computer will tell you, turn the telescope left, go up, and it'll give you instructions of where to push the telescope to, what position to go to line it up with your object, but it doesn't have motors to actually do that for you. You still have to move the telescope. Well, this sounds fantastic, right? Right off the bat, it sounds amazing that I could set up my telescope and say, show me Andromeda, and the telescope would move there. It's actually not that simple to use these, because before you get to that point, you have to calibrate the telescope so that it knows where on the Earth it is and what orientation it's in. And to do this, you have to basically point at a star and tell the telescope, okay, right now you are pointing at, for example, Arcturus. And then you point to a second star and you go, okay, now you're pointed at Vega. Yeah, those two are up at the same time. And by doing that, the computer in the telescope is able then to make its map of the sky and will then know where everything is, and then you can use the go-to commands. But you need to have a familiarity of the night sky to be able to complete that step and to set it up. So as great as these are, we actually don't recommend computerized telescopes for beginners. because again, you need that familiarity of the night sky to be able to set it up. They also, of course, are a lot more expensive because you're paying for that computer. But these are a great option for an intermediate telescope user. All right, so a couple of other things to take into consideration. So we've got our telescope type, we've got our telescope mount. Now, the next thing you'll notice is telescopes come in a number of different sizes. The size is what we call the aperture. And that's basically talking about the size of the main mirror or lens in the telescope. And generally, you would think bigger is better, right? The bigger the mirror or the lens, the more light you're able to collect, and the brighter things are going to look in your telescope. And you can see examples of that right here. Looking at the same object through different aperture telescopes, things look bigger and brighter. But there is things to consider. Obviously, bigger seems better, but if you're wanting a telescope that you can take out with you, you need to consider the portability. Because the bigger the telescope, the heavier it is, and the harder it is to move around. So you need to consider whether you're going to be lugging this thing to different sites, if it's just going to stay in your backyard. You also need to consider who's going to be using it, because in a lot of cases, the bigger telescope, your eyepiece where you look through the telescope is going to be higher off the ground. So if you have a lot of younger, smaller kids, you need to consider whether they will be able to reach that eyepiece or whether you're going to need something like a step stool in order for people to be able to look through it. All right, so before we kind of summarize everything and take a look at some examples of some good beginner telescopes, I do want to just straight up say it. Don't be tempted by the super, super cheap box, why did I say box market? Box store telescopes. Yes, the price tag is tempting, but you get what you pay for, right? You can see that these are refracting telescopes. And at the price that you'd get these from, you're probably getting a plastic lens and not even a glass lens. The mounts that they sit on are very wobbly, very unstable. They're difficult to use and move. And the views that you get through them are not really anything good. I mean, these boxes tend to advertise these fantastic sights through the telescope, but it's a very small aperture telescope. So the best you could do is see craters on the moon, maybe see Jupiter's and maybe Saturn's rings, but you're not going to be able to see that much because it's a small telescope. And more often than not, what this ends up doing is turning that interest that someone has in astronomy and using telescopes and things, and it turns that off because they're so frustrated by the user experience with the cheap telescope. So I know it's tempting, but we highly recommend to stay away from these, and I'm going to show you some fairly affordable options for beginner telescopes that will work so much better than these would. So, in general, if you are looking for a beginner's telescope, this is what we're going to recommend. We recommend a reflecting telescope. We recommend getting an Altitude-Azimuth mount. And we do not recommend a computerized or go-to telescope to begin with. And we recommend getting a telescope that's 4 to 8 inches in aperture. You don't really want to go any smaller than 4 inches because any smaller than 4 inches and you're basically just getting a telescope to look at the moon, and that's it. And in general, if you want something that's really portable, you don't want to go more than 8 inches. So this 4 to 8 inch range gives you really good views of solar system objects and even some deep space objects as well, while still being portable and easy to move around. I also put the millimeter range for this because you'll notice, especially on the smaller end of telescopes, the aperture is given in millimeters instead of inches. So you want to stay pretty much above 100 millimeters in aperture. All right, now there are a lot of different telescope brands out there. These are the ones that we either have direct experience working with or people that we know and trust who use telescopes a lot work with and say are reliable brands. So for your beginner regular telescope, Orion, Aperture, or Skywatcher are fantastic brands of telescopes. And for your computerized go-to telescopes, for your more intermediate telescope, Meade and Celestron are fantastic brands. Now, I do want to pause right here and say, since I am mentioning specific brands and I am about to give some specific products, we at the Planetarium and me as an individual are in no way associated with these companies. We do not get any sort of compensation for recommending them. This is all just off of personal experience of either ourselves or others that we work with. So if you want an actual product of here's a great beginner telescope to go buy, let me tell you. So the best type of telescope is a Dobsonian telescope, which is an reflector on an Alt-Az mount. It looks like this. And so specifically, this is the one that I generally point people to, the Orion SkyQuest XT6. So it's a 6-inch telescope, right in that range, great views, but still very portable. The benefit to the Dobsonian is this tube is very lightweight and it separates from the base. So you can carry the tube and the base separately, which makes them very easy to move, very portable. And I really like this kind of kit, although you can get just the telescope itself. But I like this kit because it provides some good resources for your kind of beginnings into using a telescope and night sky viewing. It gives you a couple of extra accessories like a red flashlight, which is always great to have when going out, because a red light lets you see, but it doesn't disrupt your night vision, so you still are dark adapted. So this is a fantastic option for a beginner telescope, and I do have a direct link to it down in the video description. Now, I know that this is still a little bit pricey. You're looking at about $400. So if you'd like something that is a little bit cheaper, but still good quality, Orion also makes tabletop telescopes. With the idea being, instead of having the long base so that it sits on the ground and you can look through it, it has a shorter base that you sit on a tabletop and then look through. Of course, that does bring some obvious cons to the table of you have to have a table to set it on, but you can see it does end up coming at a much cheaper price because of that. And this is another really good option to kind of get into telescope viewing and beginner telescope, especially if you do know you're going to be somewhere that has a tabletop that you can set it on. So another good, very affordable option that is going to give you fantastic results, easy to use, and let you see a lot of the night sky. All right, so now that we have our telescope, let's talk about kind of what you can expect from the first time using your telescope and some things to consider like eyepieces. So depending on what telescope you go with, you may have a little bit of assembly. Now, the main telescope tube itself, you are never going to have to put together unless you specifically buy a telescope kit to put together the entire thing, which you can buy, and I really want to do at some point in my life. I'm going to build my own telescope completely. But what you might need to do is put like the base together that the telescope sits on, and it would just be screwing a few pieces together. Very easy assembly, so nothing crazy there. The next thing you're going to need to do once that is all set up, you could just go straight out and start looking at it, but something that's really useful that all telescopes, oh, I won't say all because I can't definitively say all, most telescopes have, and any that you buy you should look for, it should have a finder scope. And so so this is kind of an example of one, and here it is attached to the telescope. That's also a small bit of assembly that you may need to do, is screw the finder scope onto the telescope tube. But what this is it's basically a reticle. I've never said that word out loud. It helps you sight your targets. So it has either a target or a little crosshair so that you can look through the finder scope and align the telescope very easily with the object you want to look at, say, for example, Jupiter. And then you can look through the eyepiece and Jupiter will be right there in your field of view. It just makes it easier to align the telescope. But in order, when you first get started, you're going to have to align everything up, and you're going to have to align the finder scope with the telescope view. And there are instructions on how to do that. I would recommend just being patient. And if you have trouble with this sort of thing, if you're struggling to get your finder scope set up and aligned, you can always kind of reach out to us and we can help with that as well. And then after that, you're basically good to go. All you need to do at that point is figure out what you want to look at, which you could do by either just going, hey, there's a really bright thing in the sky, let's point the telescope over there. Or you could use a sky map or an app to kind of figure out exactly what it is you want to look at. And then you align your telescope and you're good to go, maybe. You might need to focus the telescope. So the little tube that the eyepiece sits in is going to have a knob that moves the eyepiece in and out. And that's going to focus the image. So if things are looking blurry, or if a star just isn't looking like a star, play around with this knob until you get things in focus, and then you're good to go. And you will be viewing the night sky through your telescope. So lastly, finally answering your question about eyepieces. You will notice that there are many different types or many different sizes of eyepieces. And generally the eyepiece is described by the focal length of the eyepiece. And basically what this does is different focal length eyepieces give you different amounts of zoom. And so if you want to zoom in on an object, you want to change your eyepiece. And the general rule of thumb is the smaller the number, the smaller the focal length, the more zoom you have. So if you have a 25 millimeter focal length eyepiece and a 10 millimeter, the 10 millimeter is going to be more zoomed in. And so in general, when you're first starting out your night, you actually want to start with the 25, with the bigger focal length, because you can see here, you're seeing more of the sky, and that just makes it easier to adjust and find your target. And then once you're on your target, you can switch to the other eyepiece to zoom in and see in more detail. But there is a limit to how much you can zoom. And you can see with this Saturn example that each telescope does have a limit where you can't focus anymore. When you zoom in too much, you will never be able to get the image in focus. And the telescope manual will say kind of what that limit is, so you don't just go off and start buying eyepieces that you can't end up using. So yeah, that's kind of the basics to what you would do first getting started with your brand new telescope, and then kind of going off and observing with it. Some really great targets to start off with are things that you can see with your naked eye, because that makes it very easy to align to the telescope with. So things like the moon, planets. There are some other objects, excuse me, like the Pleiades, Andromeda, the Orion Nebula. These are all things that you can see with your naked eye. And then as you get more experience with the telescope, you can start looking and trying to find things that you can't find with your naked eye. And you'll learn how to go, okay, the thing I want is between those two stars. So I'm going to take my telescope and slowly move between those two stars until I find it. And the more experience you get, the better you will get at that. And that is our beginner's guide to telescope. So let's see if we have any other questions. It looks like we do.
No questions per se, just a suggestion. I think that we should do a class at the folk school in Grand Marais.
Ooh, that would be a cool idea. So I know that we take telescopes up there to do observing with, but that could be a cool idea to actually do a full class with a folk school and maybe even get one of those full telescope kits and build. I would like that. All right. Let me not be full screen of just my face anymore. So yeah, let me know if you have any other questions. You can put them down in the comments. Again, links to those two specific telescopes that I talked about are in the video description. If this was just a lot of information, which I completely understand, this video will be available for you to come back to and rewatch later. You can find it in either the videos tab of our Facebook page or over on our YouTube channel. So you can come back and pick up anything that you may have missed, or if you just want it, while you're looking for telescopes. And then, of course, again, if you have any questions, say you have a question about a specific telescope, or you have a telescope and you're having a little bit of trouble getting it up and running, you can always reach out to us at the Planetarium and we can help out with that. In fact, we are hoping, if everything is well, pandemic-wise, once the weather gets warm again, to start doing regular star parties, and that would be a great time to bring out your own telescope and we can kind of help you figure out how to use it and get everything working. That was something we had in the works before everything got shut down, but definitely something I want to make sure we get going again once we're able to, once it's safe to do so.
So we just got another question. Are there any places to borrow telescopes to try them out? Not that I know of. I think they're a little too expensive to just borrow.
Although I'm spoiling too many things on these streams. I will fully admit a telescope borrowing program is something that I would like to get started. I know of several planetariums that work with local libraries to create kind of a telescope borrowing program, run kind of in conjunction with the library, and so you would borrow it from the library. And that's another project that I had approached the library about, and we were starting to kind of get into the beginnings of talking things over, and then everything got shut down. So it is definitely a program that I think would be really amazing and something I'd like to have for Duluth, but no, it doesn't currently exist, and it will take a good bit of time and finding some funding sources to get going. But if it's something you're interested in, we could always use the support and love to let people know that this is something the community wants, which would hopefully make it easier for us to make that happen. All right. So I'm going to give it just another minute or two to see if any other questions do come through, and I will tell you what's coming up over the next week. So on Saturday, we are taking a tour through the universe, or adventure through the universe, where we're going to go and see as much as we can in about 30 minutes. Then next Wednesday, we have another edition of Ask an Astronomer, where we will be here to answer your questions, whatever they may be. And the next Saturday is the long-awaited next edition of our exploration series. It's been a little while since we've done a segment in our exploration series. And because we got a request for a show about nebulae, that's what we're going to do next Saturday. And so we'll take a look at these beautiful gas clouds in our galaxy and kind of look at what they're all about. Now, if you are interested in some other maybe like spacey or astronomy related gift ideas, we're actually going to be doing a post about that tomorrow with some really cool recommendations. But of course, one thing you could always do for someone out there who loves our planetarium is both support the planetarium and buy them some really cool t-shirts, and long sleeve shirts and sweaters too are in there as well. So you can find a link to our t-shirts and things down in the video description. I'm really proud of some of the designs we have out. They're really awesome, and would make a really cool gift. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. Nancy, did I answer your question well enough? Is that what you were asking? I'm assuming so, because you said thank you later, so. All right. I think we'll wrap it up there then. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. We hope this was an informative session and you're feeling more confident about maybe purchasing a telescope. As I said, you can always reach out to us for further help. And yeah, have a great rest of your evening and we will hopefully see you next time. Bye everyone.